I'd like to hand the mic to Brian Wong, who's going to be the chair adjudicator of this round.
Welcome to the grand final of Solbridge NEAO 2017. It gives me great honour to introduce the panel of judges for today. Judging the final will be Frenny from USA/China, Andre from Singapore, Bunny from Malaysia, Deborah from Malaysia, Samoya from... No, that's not Samoya, sorry, Sebon from Korea. And last but not least, Samoya from Japan. Great. Please be reminded to keep your cell phone volume to either silent or as minimal as possible. Without further ado, do we have a time? Timekeeper? Daniel, do you mind timing? Great. Without further ado, we call upon the Prime Minister to open today's debate. Hear, hear.
In the 1.0 version of a dictatorship, they kill off
Deputy Prime Minister to continue the debate today. Here.
We give a lot of power to the state. We give a lot of our rights to the state. We allow the state to dictate a lot of what happens to us. Already we've established from Brian that a state has disproportionate power when it comes to leading discussions or setting agendas for what they think is important, or opening forums on ideas that are important, or allowing referendums to take place. In this kind of situation, we're okay to concede a lot of our individual power to a state. The discussion has to become what makes a state legitimate. Is it because they make people more safe, or because there are more higher principles that a state must always adhere to and never infringe upon, that the people must believe that this is what the state also believes and intends to uphold as well? Because they cannot just claim that a situation where the state can dictate your decisions is a situation which is more safe. Maybe even if they prove that is true, which we don't think happen, because already a state is not always right when it comes to times of crisis. The opposition voices are always important when formulating the best kind of policies. If what they say was true, we would never have democracy. We just have what the state wants to happen. Rather, even if they prove to us that they can assure safety on our side of the house, two metrics of legitimacy that show why Brian's case is standing in this debate. Firstly, why legitimacy derives from the importance and valuation of freedom of speech and respecting the opposition parties and opposition voices in your nation. Secondly, the idea that there is free discourse, that there is free choice, that a state cannot manipulate the decisions that an individual citizens want to do. Rather, regardless of whether your free choice is an actual, entirely free choice, the fact that a state minimizes its ability to infringe upon the choices you make is also extremely important when determining the legitimacy of a state and conceding our power to that state. What do we want to discuss before we go into these specific themes? Firstly, they told us that it's always impossible to have meaningful levels of engagement. I think they misunderstand what situations that this debate takes place on. Unless they're trying to defend that the state can do whatever they want all the time, in which case I think it's a very strong case for us. But if they want to talk about it in situations of referendum or elections, because that's where public opinion is important. Public opinion is important when publics can make decisions, and oftentimes when it comes to things like referendums or elections, where the decision is one vote, and after a period of discussion, you have to make a yes or no decision, it means that opinions are extremely important, and the kind of discourse that takes place both on the internet and among people are also extremely important in the kind of meaningful engagement that happens. So it's not just meaningful engagement that politicians can talk to each other, but when the people are allowed to make certain decisions, it's important to recognize that that kind of meaningful engagement in the 21st century happens a lot on SNS, and they degrade the kind of discourse that happens under their side of the house. So let's go to the metrics of legitimacy we have. Before that, yes?
You stated states already have disproportionate power with other rights and other powers. How is this method uniquely different from all of those?
Okay, what we're going to tell you here is, like, obviously the metrics of legitimacy, why freedom of media, and therefore freedom of more free flow of information, of freedom to discourse, and finally, the idea that you as a citizen can make a free decision or your own decision in determining the fate of your state is extremely important to the legitimacy, to establishing the legitimacy of a said state. Let's talk about the importance of respecting an opposition party. What they fail to recognize here on their side of the house, the distinction that they never make clear, is that when we say state, we don't mean all the political parties or all the people who want to help you. When we say state, oftentimes we mean the party that is in power. In that kind of situation, it is always easier for the state to demand that because of security reasons, that there are certain measures that we have to take. So we think it's kind of time for the rhetoric that because of this kind of social issue, because of this financial issue, because there's going to be war with North Korea, like that a state can be corrupt, or that a state can do certain things, spy on their own people, steal information, or lie to their own people in order to maximize safety. We don't think that's what legitimizes a state. Just because it's safe doesn't mean you're living in a state that we believe is a just state. Rather, we think firstly it's important that if you do want to facilitate better opinions and better solutions at the end of the day, you also have to respect the opposition parties. If we take like the kind of fiat coming from their side that this will work, that these kind of online discourse will force people to act in a certain way, which is the benefit they bring, that means they're entirely ignoring the fact that it's not just the majority ruling political party that has the right to make decisions, but that there is also credible opposition parties that should be part of this discussion. The fact that a state can derive discussion into a certain sector, we think is ultimately illegitimate, but also finally makes worse policies overall because they're only considering one side of the discussion at hand. We've seen that when it comes to things like referendums. In Brexit, when Brexit, not because the state interfered, but because there's like fear-mongering as well. So you always see those kind of things. But let's talk about secondly. Let's talk about secondly. Let's talk about second factor of legitimacy, which is the idea of free choice. And here's where the example of Brexit again comes in. We're not saying that it was the state that did the fear-mongering that led to the Brexit, right? What we're saying, though, is that even in cases where there are opposition parties, or even in cases where there are media resorts that lead to speculation or fear on the people, we still think it's important for the state to minimize its role. Is not an absolutely free choice. That when someone chooses to do something in an election, you're not 100% doing it because absolutely this is like how only you believe and you never were affected by anyone else. So sometimes you are affected by the people. What's important to note here is this. We give our legitimacy and our power to make decisions, the ultimate power to make decisions to the state because we believe that the state maximizes our ability to make our own decisions. That the state minimizes their involvement in discourse and minimizes their involvement in trying to shape discourse. Ultimately, the legitimacy of a state and believing that your opinions are your own, not directed by an all-powerful or a much powerful state, is what's extremely important in allowing a state to thrive. Even if we have a state that succeeds and thrives because we're able to force everyone to adhere to a certain situation, the fact that people realize that the choices they make aren't really important, that the state can always mandate, or the state can always try to force and shape public opinion into doing certain things, delegitimizes the idea of me giving any sort of power to a state. We'd rather live in a more chaotic place and a more chaotic world if it meant that I could believe that my choices are actually important. It's important to recognize when third policy takes place, no matter how safe a world we live in, we will never be able to view the state as a legitimate source of our representation of power. That's why we're very happy to be on OG. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech and call upon the Deputy Opposition to continue the debate here. I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, and I call upon the Member of Government to continue the debate today. Hear, hear.
We think that opinions can kill a person. Opinions can shape political discourse. Opinions can manipulate how people must assess political agendas and policies. So far, the opening debate has been very value neutral in terms of what exactly must democratic governments be. What will be the extension coming from closing government? Firstly, we're going to tell you why these type of opinion shaper sites are one that is non-accountable. Meaning that you can have good opinions, you can have bad opinions, and every single individual in this room can create their own opinions. But if opinion shapers can collectivize and produce a massive amount of readers, they are not accountable to any factual and manipulated news or types of facts. And we think that's particularly harmful. Secondly, I'm going to tell you the counterfactual because we do not think that the opening house was able to tell you the comparative in this debate. We're going to tell you why it's much better that we have better assessment of opinions and political agendas under our side. Before that, just a few clarifications of what this debate is supposed to be. Firstly, we think that there is no such thing as only one single legitimate opinion. So if this debate is under the context of what exactly must be a good opinion, we would argue to you that opinion shapers drive and manipulate people to believe that there is a legitimate opinion that they should side with. So what happens? When you are paid and when you are sponsored, it means that you have more airtime in terms of, let's say, the types of supporters that you have, because it means that your sites grant more popularity, whether that would be in an independent journal blog or whether that would be in having a group page on Facebook. It also means that there's an ability for you to even have paid supporters to be able to read these types of sites. What does this mean? It means that any type of counter opinions that opposition wants to have already gets shut down because they do not have a basis, because these opinion shapers are already dominating and driving the force. We think that the unequal coverage is already unfair in terms of the types of opinions that you would like to garner. So fine, there may be diverse opinions, but the ability in which these diverse opinions are being catered on the opposition side is already less because of these paid types of sites. Secondly, let's also assess what is the characterization of these opinion shapers. Usually, they could be very biased, and it's also based on a certain popular figure or celebrities. Look at the Philippines, in which Duterte was driven by Mopra Yusun blog. Second, look at Sasa. These are the types of things in which it is empowered by the current administration. Why is this particularly harmful? The way in which they put or provide content is based on pretending like their site is legitimate. What does this mean? They do not tell the readers and they do not tell average Joe people that this is an opinion-based site. So when they provide content in the news site, instead of saying it's from economist.com, they screw that it's economist.com, right? So what does this mean? Your average mass individuals, in which those who claim to be apathetic, those who claim to not have a real or in-depth knowledge of politics, do not know whether or not this opinion is true to begin with. But because these opinion shapers are already sponsored and have massive popularity, they tend to believe that this is the only news site in which they must rely on, and that's why it's particularly harmful. No, thank you. Lastly, we also think that it's very harmful in which they contextualize this debate to be post-colonial states. What is really confusing under opening opposition side? Firstly, they say that political agendas being shaped by governments is really good because they're the ones who can shape the world and say that they're the ones who are more effective in terms of making these policies. But at the same time, their context is that it's post-colonial states and very weak democracy. So I'm not so sure as to what extent is the effectiveness of the governments that they claim to be. But what am I going to assume? Either way, we think that the biggest problem, I'm going to assume that it's also post-colonial states, you have very nationalistic ideas. Because the way in which you provide opinion are things on very targeted tactics or demonization of other factors. If you have neutral opinions or if you have facts, the ability in which people provide agenda or provide information is based on actual meritocratic-based systems. Under your side, the way you garner support by these opinion shapers are things that target towards personal sympathy, towards things that people think that this is good. These are the ways in which you drive nationalistic ideas or sensationalization. So we think that it's particularly bad in terms of you wanting to change and provide good political agendas from a genuine discourse. No, thank you. Lastly, if they say that it's from third world and semi-weak democracies, we assume that they have political dynasties, extreme divide, bipolarization. Lastly, a lack of education of your public. What this means is that the ability in which you empower these individuals to create their opinions is less, because now you continuously allow the government to feed in the types of narratives that they want to have. If you want fair democracies and if you want individuals to provide their own opinions, the government should not control it. First argument on our side. that these opinion shapers are non-accountable. We think that it's a very convenient tool for these governments. What does this mean? When they state false information or information that is particularly targeted or particularly harmful, what happened? And this is the example of Mocha you saw. She made her poor mass media, because that was her main supporters, to believe that the war on drugs by Duterte was very beneficial for them. When in real, the people who are being killed and the people who are being victimized by the war on drugs were the same supporters, were the same poor individuals. What does this mean? These opinion shapers are non-accountable towards their readers. They're not genuinely into the platform of their loyalists, because what they care for is money, and we do not think that's good. But secondly, and more importantly, whenever they need to be accountable and say that you are providing false information, and this is the difference, even if you do have biased news sites, at least we are able to put them in the platform and say that you are providing false information. Under your side, these opinion shapers say, wait, I'm just journalist, I'm just an opinion shaper. Why is my opinion necessarily harmful? These are the excuses in which they provide, saying that it's simply an opinion and have no leverage to provide the factual information. We think that's particularly harmful, because even if these opinions may be questionable, the ability for society, the ability for individuals to question that goes away. Lastly then, why then do we think that we create fair discourse? No, thank you. We think that the fair discourse that we would like to provide is a fair assessment of different individual parties. Why? Because we think that when they say that you want to have engineered political agendas to get things done, first and foremost, that's non-exclusive. Because generally, if you have people who have election systems and campaigns, you would still have governments disseminating information of what exactly their political agendas are to begin with. So people who want to vote for will still care. But if you think that these are apathetic people, we're also fine. We think comparatively it's better to have apathetic people, because these are the individuals who are less prioritized compared to someone who is really, really in-depth prioritized to have this personal sentiment towards these policies. So what then is our counterfactual? We think of first, actual accountable news sites. Secondly, equal fact-checking. Third, opinions that are not automatically shutting down because of the unequal and unfair platform. Lastly, we think that it's a less reliance on these satirical sites. We think that now you are able to say that your opinion may be valid and the other person's opinion may be valid, because it's not based on an extremely dominating and polarizing site. So we think that even if you have majority people, even if you have trends, it's perfectly fine, because at least the ability for people to stand up and say that this is a certain opinion is now better justified on the R side. So fine, even in the worst case scenario in which there would be trends, in which there would be a dominating narrative of the political agenda, the comparative that you must seek on the R side is that it's still something that's valid. It's still something that individuals can base from an actual source. On their side, people are non-accountable, people do not know. We think that's harmful. Please vote for Solbridge, and we're very proud to bring back the trophy. Thanks.
I thank the Member of Government, and I call upon the Member of Opposition to continue his debate today here.
Okay. So we think that the debate so far has been taking place before the advent of social media, because we think it's idealistic for government to believe that suddenly when the government stops doing this, then other people will not do it anymore. We think that it is impossible that suddenly when the government does not do this, people will suddenly start believing accountable sources, people will suddenly start fact-checking. We think we need to bring this debate back to the 21st century. So what we are going to extend on closing opposition is why, because of the change in context, because of social media's change on politics and how it occurs right now, why that means that all of the mechanisms on opening government and closing government fail. So let's talk firstly about the way people got information before social media, right? So before this, it was usually traditional media sources through which politicians, people who had credibility, people who had information, disseminated the information that they needed to. So politicians could make speeches that they could reasonably expect other people to get access to, right? We think that media, like New York Times, all those newspapers, TV shows, they were held accountable because those were sources that were said to be credible, disseminating information clearly. So the way people made decisions based on this information was that they took all of this information in, but they got to take a step back before making these decisions. That's why it was more likely that they could make rational decisions and more accountable decisions that were weighed upon better when traditional media was there. But unfortunately, now we're in the 21st century, right? What has changed? One, the democratization of information. So every single person, regardless of what kind of credentials they have, what kind of experience they have, they all get an equal voice, right? Every single person has a Facebook page, can get a Facebook page, and depending on like what kind of material they do, regardless of that credibility, they get to like disseminate that information. But secondly, we think the information that is said to be popular or that disseminates more under their side of the house is information that is emotive, right? So the information that people get is generally like viral information, images that make people feel really angry or really happy, and that's the exact kind of information that people receive. So what happens as a result of this? We think there are two main bad things. One, we think there's huge distrust to previously credible sources. This is not just politicians in power, it's not just Shinzo Abe, but it's also every single other opposition party that was also in power, it's also the media, it's also like corporations. Every single person that used to have power in the previous past gets distrusted. And the reason for this is because people just feel disenfranchised by a system that they believe is working against them. It's easy to flare up emotions about disenfranchisement, about there being a conspiracy theory against you and the common man, and therefore we believe that leads to people believing that these big sources are against them, right? Which means that the government sources, like the credible government sources that they said would be so popular under their side of the house, simply do not get across to normal voters, right? Because voters are already disposed against what people say to start with, which means that these voices are not getting across. We think this is hugely problematic because that creates the exact inequality between the opposition voices, or rather like the Kramers, right? The people who say the government is always doing something wrong in comparison to more credible sources. But we think that the second bad thing that happens is that the opposition changes, right? The quality of the opposition doesn't become based on rational discourse, but it becomes based on like more like emotive stuff. So this is exactly what happened to the Republican Party of the United States of America, right? So the reason that Donald Trump got so popular, or that like populist politicians are taking over everywhere, is because they take platform by denying everyone else, right? They take credibility by saying that, oh, okay, everything is messed up, we need something different. They also fabricate opinions, right? Meaning they like tell lies to other individuals, and we think that these people have a disproportionately strong voice in the social media landscape. It's easy for someone complaining about the status quo to get popularity from a populist who also feels disenfranchised, which is why all of these things mean that there is a disproportionate power imbalance between the opposition and opposition, not like parties, but like individuals who simply oppose the status quo, and also the people in power. Before we go on, yeah.
That may be harmful, but I think we already established a clear distinction from a government whose legitimacy stems from the belief that the entity governing you allows you to make choices without its influence.
Okay, let's talk one thing about their weird principle on freedom of speech. One, we don't think that freedom of speech is limited under our side of the house, right? We don't think that people like are prevented from speaking out even under our side of the house. It's just that other people get to speak as well. Two, we think that even if you have freedom of speech, you don't get to force people to believe what you say. And we think under their side of the house, it is less likely that people will believe credible opinions based on evidence and information, which is why we think the opinions and the results garnered under their side of the house are particularly harmful, right? So let's talk about why this is particularly bad. So what is at stake here, right? One, we think elections are at stake here. People with moderate these people are like less likely to get attention and often fail, right? We think secondly, something that is also bad is that in terms of policy, there is less nuanced discussion on policy, right? So for example, Japan had a very heated debate about nuclear energy after the 3/11 earthquake. But we think we needed nuclear energy still, because if we did not have 20% of nuclear energy, the energy imbalance would mean that we had to import huge amounts of oil, which would also be very harmful on our country and on our economy, right? But the discourse became, oh, nuclear energy is also bad, always bad. This is a conspiracy against the common man. The government is trying to poison us with all this nuclear radioactive material again. Sorry, sit down. Again, so that became the discourse as a result of social media existing. So that's why the government has had to be very, very careful in the way it moves forward with nuclear energy, when really we should be having a discussion about what extent of danger there is about nuclear energy and what extent of economic damage there is, and therefore which path we should actually take. So we think that discourse only becomes possible when these armies of opinion shapers are able to also have a voice. So what happens as a result? of us having army of opinion shapers, right? We think that the way people view agendas change because now both opinions can come across, right? When previously only the opposition who had complained about everything had a voice, now on our side of the house, the party in power and the people who want to promote like actual opinions as the government believes should be promoted can also get across. So we think that the idea about nuclear energy being needed for economic reasons can also have a voice on people's social media feeds, right? So this is important because now when both things are on their feeds and when both are given an exactly equal platform, that is the point at which people see both opinions and people start to think or people start to judge. This does not happen under their side of the house because one, only the opposition people have voice, but two, the politicians who are speaking on TV are already discredited to the extent that people do not believe them and do not take them seriously. So we think that we get better political outcomes under our side of the house, which is the very foundation of the legitimacy of any government. We think government should create good discourse for people. The foundations of this lay in when we have an army of opinion shapers. That is why we're supremely proud to oppose this motion.
I thank the member of the opposition and I call upon the government whip to close off today's government bench. Hear, hear.
We think the biggest assumption came from both opening operation and closing operation was they think the government will likely going to act benevolent. We think this is absolutely nonsense because most likely government has particular incentive, like for example, they want to maintain their regime. Like if you look at the Duterte, he actively utilized these armies to kill other opposition opinions. We think this is not likely scenario that they are trying to like making nonsense in this debate. And people, we think, because all the outcome and consequences of the policies and the way this government move is always directly related to people within the society. That is particularly why each individual within the society has to have a capacity to assess the independent accessibility of the information. But they will not going to have that particular information assessment because this is not like other free opinion sharing program. Rather, it is directly a government is funding for every single institution or organization or like community to kill, particularly have missions to kill other particular opposite idea. That is particularly why they actively go into that particular opposition opinion community and they start to have a terror and they demonizing them and individually because they have so much capability and so much money. That is why they are actively doing that. Furthermore, because most of the, for instance, if minority have poor or because their living status is hard, that is particularly easy for governments to persuade these particular people to, because we're going to pay you, can you do this? It is likely they will likely going to do that. And also people who are less capable of understanding and have a shallow understanding of politics, they're likely going to just get involved into that particular government's idea. We think this is further hindering and you demonizing these other peoples and there is no room or whatsoever for negotiation or future compromise from under their side of model. And if we don't have particular opinion and you try to pretend, and the most important thing is most likely this army do not say, oh, I'm from the army. They're likely going to say they're not army. They pretend they're just normal citizen and they try to portray the idea that this is
genuinely truth of the government. And because they always try to frame it as something that is so good for this nation, we think this is absolutely nonsense. Even if it is good for nation, in the end of the as a consequence, we think it's absolutely nonsense because there is no room for proper process for these people to have a fully access, and even more, that information is likely going to be false or not given for these people to fully understand and make a precise calculation, because all the consequences will likely going to have been bared by those people on the ground, but that they don't have information or most likely has been distorted by this army. We think this is absolutely nonsense, and that responsibility and that accountability will not going to be able to be compensated, because there is no accountability no entity for us to ask for the accountability, because these people will try to say, it's just like Sally told you, I'm just journalist, this is my pure opinion, that there's nothing or even have no capacity or no means for these minority peoples or like opposite parties to actively going against this particular idea. When then most important thing is when there is a like they try to frame it as there is some sort of check and balance exists, so it is okay. We don't think it's absolutely making sense, because even if it has been existed, this check and balance existed, as soon as you utilize this army, because you start to give excessive amount of exposure and information and powers to this particular regime, meaning that it would dramatically remove and make this particular regime and idea of the national idea or the current regime's idea permanized, and that because the government will likely utilize this to solidify their own current status, meaning that they can easily bash out all the opposition opinion. We think it is absolutely making hard for future minority or opposition parties to enter into even discourse, because they already make all the barriers for these opposition parties to come to join and have a meaningful discussion or this discourse. We think unless they provide a particular mechanism that will likely going to make sure there is a check and balance and make sure that information will not going to fool people and deceive their consequences of that information, we think opposition will not be able to win this debate. And furthermore, even if in worst case scenario, sit down please, became extremely hard for opposition opinions to come out and say something, because most likely there is humongous amount of hatred towards this opposition opinion, because you actively utilize, not just denying, you are demonizing them with all the insert that you can ever possibly do for our opposition party. That leads to people antagonized and bipolarized, meaning that people influenced by this army or opinion, they will likely going to form a groups, and this making the radical opinion or one-sided like towards governments even more aggravated, because you are likely going to have less exposure to other types of opinion. That is why it's never going to be mitigated. That will lead to more antagonized radical idea in the end of the day, meaning that there will be no, like, even if there is a discourse that maybe happen, that will be discourse happen with the false information, and will most likely that discourse will never going to be achieve a good discourse in the end of the day. That dreaming of like making good policy with this particular policy, we don't think this ever will come true under opposition case. And that excuse will demonize people, and particularly this government will utilize this particular, because this is public's wills and public's good, and this is good for nationalism or a nation, people will likely going to demonize opposition party because you are not good for a nation. This is particularly harmful, because that take out all the legitimacy or leverage of the opposition parties to talk about even what's good for the nation, what kind of policy is good for a nation. Thank you very much.
I thank the government whip for his speech, and I call upon the opposition whip to close off today's debate. Hear.
Before summarizing this debate, I want to make some clarifications about the context and countries that this debate should happen. he told you that we can have a meaningful debate and we can have a meaningful difference in this debate in the mature democracy to some extent. Because we had many random contexts coming from triology, like Hong Kong, a third world country, literacy, but we told you this debate should focus on countries which have decent democracies, even though it's not perfect. Because if government has a very strong power in the current status quo, the armies of opinion shapers are only tiny part of strategy that constitute unfair power of governments. That's why it's not meaningful to debate as to why this method is particularly harmful in democracy in Hong Kong or other countries when they're imprisoned anti-government journalists or they're going to have like other power that makes unfair government. Government asserted it's just an assumption that government is benevolent actor. We told you we don't assume it's perfectly benevolent actor, but especially but at least they have the free media and they have freedom of expressions and they don't like delete the accounts of anti-government journalists in Twitter. Those contexts are necessary context and justifiable and reasonable context that should fair this debate should happen. So from closing opposition, we told you how beyond general talks about discourse and criticism, we focused on why on SNS and digital world states are sometimes very vulnerable to anti-government sentiments and why this method is particularly necessary and important for governments to maintain the government and states in a healthy manner.
Sir.
So I want to make the summary from two perspectives. First of all, I want to talk about what kind of discussions happen in both sides and what consequences and importance both sides of discourse bring us. And secondly, more importantly, I want to talk about the principle of justification because at base they're talking about just is unfair, is undemocratic. But I want to talk about how the democracy is not only about principle, but also we are talking about effectiveness and important consequences that method is bringing us. That's what I want to talk about later. So first about what kind of discourse is happening currently in our side and their side. And government benches share the argument, saying armies of opinion shapers are so strong and so dominant in the SNS and that crowd out of opposition opinions or so forth. But firstly, they ignore the characteristic of general public and opposition party that is coming from my partner. We told you in many mature democracies, citizens are very skeptical, and people like conspiracy theories and people love scandals, and it is very stated sometimes very vulnerable to the opposition party, especially in SNS, where people can fabricate information about the state and people can say anything about the government. They are vulnerable in sometimes. They have to tell us government is going to crowd out opposition opinions even though we have this particular context where the opposition parties are going to rampantly launch like opposition opinions to states even with fabricated information. We deny that when we realize the context that this debate should happen. And secondly, we told you opposition parties are also using this method, similar methods in this particular context on SNS because they also have an incentive to fabricate information and then convince the public in order to take power in government in the first place. We think this method is necessary against evil opposition journalists and opposition parties that we are talking about. And also we told you how this is a very important method for government to continue to take this strategy. Because government is sometimes very vulnerable, especially it is very sensational issues like nuclear energies, and it also is about earthquakes, it is about national security. Sometimes people are going to just against, for example, the US bases of military in Japan because that's just scared of it. But we think the government has the responsibility and has the right to convince citizens how it is necessary and how it is justifiable from the perspective of national security or national interest in the long-term perspective. That's why we think it is necessary to convince the people against a very strong opposition party who are rampantly using the fabricated information and also they are using the paying money for many people to do that similar thing in the current status quo. That's why it's justifiable. Yes.
All of your premise assume that you just want government to conceal any information that is very controversial or that is very consequential to the individuals. Why do you want to do that when the people who are most affected are the same individuals? Why do you think that they do not have a legitimacy to have their own opinions and assessments of these information?
I want to talk about any principle justification. The government has a right to, so I want to talk about now principle justification. I think that we believe the government has right to nudge citizens to agree with necessary policies that those rights can compromise perfect democracy to some extent. We believe policies are not only about superficial philosophies of the philosophers, rather than politics that for better consequences that citizens can receive. That is a very important principle for democracy and politics. That's why we withhold confidential information about militaries and diplomacies, even though if those information can help people to make a different decision after they know the confidential information about militaries and diplomacies. Because it's necessary to hide those information in order to protect citizens from military issues and diplomatic issues. We are compromising democracy to some extent, hide the information and not citizens to make some certain kind of decision in the current status quo. And also government are educating individuals in schools for children, even though it's sometimes biased to a particular view. But it's very important in order to maintain and make a cohesive society as a government. We think it's necessary compromise for democracy to a certain extent. And they told us they try to deny this principle by saying the government paying money for citizens, that's why they're not accountable after the first place. But we already told you that using money is not only method for the government. We pay, for example, the public servants to maintain the government, even though they're not perfectly liking government policies. And also opposition parties can use this method to a certain extent. Those examples empirically prove is also legitimate for government to use these methods in order to against the opposition party in particular context. And also from government, opposition government bit, they focused on anonymity of this method. First of all, we told you, every participant on SNS is in the discourse is already anonymous. It's not only about the government, the opposition party, and other actors also anonymous in this debate. And also, it's not different from what government is doing in another scenario, right? We cannot even know, we cannot know the information about military secrets. We cannot know the process of diplomacies, but we have to make a decision based on that. That's why anonymity or information asymmetry cannot be a reason for the government side to deny this motion. We told you the efficiency, the better consequences, just a legitimate reason for government to use this method in order to protect citizens, in order to make national security and national interest better for all public in society. So what closing government and closing opposition did is we contextualize how SNS is going in a particular context and what is the characteristic of people on the ground. And we told you that the principles are sufficient enough in order to compromise democracy to some extent in order to achieve better consequences. For all these reasons, I'm very proud.
I think all the teams in this debate invite everyone to give them another round of applause.